Okay, good enough. We have. So, hello everyone. This is Chandresh, and I hope that all of you are doing well and your preparation for CISSP test is going as planned. So far, we have discussed briefly about first four domains. In today's session, we are going to discuss about the fifth domain, which is identity and access management. But before that, as always, you shall keep your mics on mute during the entire session. And if you have any doubts or any questions, just note it down somewhere, pin it, and we'll take it up at the end of this session. So we reserve some 15-20 minutes, and to whatever extent the discussion allows us to go. By the end of the session, we discuss all the questions, all doubts and queries. So pin it, note it down somewhere so that you do not forget it, and we'll take up all your questions by the end of the session. We have been training and upskilling professionals since 2016. Our trainers are having vast industry experience in the domain of cybersecurity, data privacy, security operations, and related fields of expertise. So that is what it is about. As you must be aware that the grave need of subject matter experts in the industry nowadays, there's a grave need of subject matter experts in the industry, and the trend of which is only catalyzed by this COVID-led pandemic situation, which has simply raised the demand so high that there is a gap of skill now, a gap of skilled professionals in information security field. And it is our best interest to keep upskilling ourselves in on-demand skills. That is where InfoSec Train can be your partner in equipping you with the quality content and the mentor-led guidance that we offer you. And we have a good string of credentials attached to enforce that claim. Moving on to the clientele, here's a list of organizations who have trusted us for upskilling their staff, which is nothing short of an accomplishment for us. So yeah, there are some known names like TCS, Ericsson, NIIT, SBI, etc., so on and so forth. InfoSec Train also helps you throughout your journey in becoming certified professionals. So we assist you throughout your journey of getting certified. We also partner with major global accreditation bodies like ISACA, EC Council, and CompTIA. So agenda of this session is, so far we have discussed, as I've already told you, that so far we have discussed the first four domains of CISSP test courseware. And we have briefly touched upon how the course is structured and how one shall attack the course moving forward in terms of how to prepare prepare for it, what kind of subject, what kind of material to refer to, and how to refer to that material, how to read that, how to use that material to the fullest potential. So basically, it has CISSP test has 8 domains. It will be having 100 to 150 questions. You'll be allocated with 33 hours, and if you manage to score more than 70% in first 100 questions, you won't need to solve the rest of the questions. So say if you finish, if you obtain 70% plus in the first 100 questions in first 100 minutes of your start of the test, then you won't need to go any further in your first 100 minutes of the test, of the start of the test. You'll be able to get certified. You crack the test and you pass the test, and then it is a matter of proving your experience and all to get certified. Then we discussed about CIA triad. We discussed about frameworks. We discussed briefly about risk management framework. We discussed about risk assessment, analysis, risk treatment plan, residual risk. We talked how policy, procedure, baseline, guidelines, all these documents are arranged in a hierarchical manner. Then we talked about asset inventory, classification, categorization, labeling and marking, etc. We talked about data roles like their data stewards, custodians, and owners, and so on and so forth. Then we talked about data life cycle. We talked about secure destruction, defensible destruction of data, and we talked about handling and archiving related to the entire data life cycle. Then we talked about system architectures, where we talked about security models as well, which was some of these were Clark-Wilson model, Bill Lapadula, and Viva model, etc., etc. There we also talked about the reference monitor concept and the enforcement of reference monitor, which is a secure kernel. security kernel, sorry. So that is what we already discussed about. Then we talked about TCP, trusted computing base. We talked about cryptology. In cryptology, we talked about symmetric, asymmetric encryption. We talked about PKI, how digital certificates work and digital signatures, etc. Then we talked about common criteria, which is basically an evaluation criteria of whatever security tool or technology that you're planning on implementing in your environment. So now we move forth, and we will today discuss about the domain 5, which is identity and access management. And before we start this discussion, as usual, we'll first go through some questions from the previous domains that we have already discussed. And how do we attack this section is, I'll give you one question, I'll read it for you, I'll read the options for you. You'll have 10 seconds, I'll give you 10 seconds to drop your options, drop the answer that you think is correct in the chat box. I'll review the chat box. If there's no, if the option is unanimously accepted, say if the correct answer is A, and all have, or mostly 80-90% people have posted A as the correct option, then we won't discuss it. And if there is a contradiction, if there is a confusion, which will be visible in the chat section, then we'll discuss about it. So moving on to the first question. Next-gen-Tech's third-party SaaS cloud vendor has been found with multiple violations of the European GDPR regulation. An investigation has discovered that the vendor stores its cloud data in countries that do not have any mechanism for the enforcement of protecting personal data. The supply chain of different subcontractors who maintain the flow of the SaaS platform have also stored private data on hundreds of their servers, even after the data is no longer useful or relevant. Additionally, the data custodians responsible for media backups and maintenance are capable of viewing the data in plain text, which is the data at rest. Next-gen-Tech's senior team wants to continue using the cloud vendor, but the privacy issues must be addressed first. So what is the best way to continue using the cloud vendor's services? Your options are implementation of tokenization, request data encryption, C, conducting a risk assessment, or D, data obfuscation. And your time starts now. So drop your options, drop your answers in chat. Okay, time's up. And there is a divide of opinions in chat. So we'll discuss this question. So what actually happened is there was a breach of regulatory requirement. And what is the driving factor here is the team wants to continue using the cloud vendor services. Okay, now we can enforce certain controls in order to mitigate the situation. But since there is no breach has happened so far, like discovered that vendor is okay. So no breach is evident here. There's no breach, no question of breach here. Okay. It was just a third-party audit. So first party is the one who is getting benefited, that is next-gen technology. And second party is my cloud service provider. And there's an independent audit which is conducted by third party. In that audit, it is discovered that such a thing is going on and regulatory requirements are not met. Now I can request for data encryption that will mitigate my this area where there was this area where they are able to, the people people responsible for media backup and maintenance are capable of viewing the data in plain text. So that can be mitigated with this option. I can obfuscate the data, meaning basically modify it in such a way that it doesn't make sense to the people who are observing it or viewing it or having access to it. That is also a mitigation. and I can implement tokenization. But tokenization, basically what it means is, instead of sending the data in itself, you send a token saying yes, no, the context, say that validity of that particular data, piece of data that you're having access to and whatnot. So a token is simply a message and not an actual data itself. For example, if you're processing credit card transactions, and yeah, you're processing credit card transactions, and instead of sending the credit card numbers, the pin and expiry date, CVV, etc., in plain text format, you can simply send that, okay, the transaction was successful or not successful, or maybe the balance was insufficient or sufficient, or stuff like that. Instead of telling that, okay, the balance was this much, you tell that in tokenization, you tell that the balance was insufficient or balance was sufficient to carry out the transactions and stuff like that. So these all three are mitigation techniques, but this conducting a risk assessment, it will basically allow the next gen technology to understand, to form a framework and form a baseline that, okay, these controls shall be implemented in these conditions. So since they were not having any mitigation controls already in place, they should carry out a risk assessment first, and then figure out what risks do they want, what kind of a risk treatment do they want. Do they want to accept the risk? Do they want to mitigate the risk and stuff like that, to bring the risk exposure within the risk appetite of the organization? So the correct option for this one is option C. Moving on to the second question. Next question. Chandresh is designing a cryptographic system for use within his company. The company has 1,000 employees and they plan to use an asymmetric encryption system. They would like the system to be set up so that any pair of arbitrary users may communicate privately. How many total keys will they need? Your time starts now. You can drop your options in the chat box now. Okay, your time's up. Almost everybody has gotten it right. If I were to ask you guys, okay, anybody just make a note of it, that please remind me to talk about when we are using, instead of asymmetric encryption, if we were using symmetric encryption, how many keys will we require? How many keys will we require? Yeah, exactly. Not question mark 2, but by 2. Sorry, Karthik. It will be n into n minus 1 by 2, number of unique keys. So why it is 2000? It is 2000 because there are 1,000 individuals, and every individual has got a private and public key pair because it is asymmetric encryption. Hence, you have 2000 unique keys. Everybody has gotten it right. So congratulations, everyone. Moving on to the next question, which is LA is planning her organization's asset retention efforts and wants to establish when the company will remove assets from use. Which of the following is typically the last event in a manufacturer's or software provider's lifecycle? Your time starts now. You can leave the options, correct options, in chat box. Okay, time's up, guys. And seems like there is a divide between A and B. So yeah, let's talk about this. Cool. Your time's up. So let's talk about this. This is your project life cycle. This is your product life cycle. This is your entire life cycle. Now your general availability will be somewhere here, after which it will not be made generally available. Then you keep on supporting this solution for, say, this is your end of support. And finally, when you want the organizations to move on from this, from using this at all, is when it is end of life. Okay, so the last deadline will be deadline will be this end of life. So option is A is correct for this one. Congratulations to whoever has opted for option A. Moving on to the next question, which is which one of the following components should be included in an organization's emergency response guidelines? First option is list of individuals who should be notified of an emergency incident. Long-term business continuity protocols. C is activation procedures for organizations' cold sites. And D is contact information for ordering equipments. You can drop your options in the chat box now. Your time starts. So everybody, I think everybody has gotten it right. A is the correct option because that is what shall come first in your BCP. Yeah, now coming to the content, which is identity and access management. So we'll start with the basics of it is IAAA, which is identity, authentication, authorization, and auditing or accounting. Okay, what is identity? Identity is basically claiming to be somebody. Say I'm saying that I'm Chandresh. Cool. What is authentication? Authentication is means to establish that whoever is claiming to be whoever is that somebody. For example, if I'm claiming to be Chandresh, I'll show my Aadhaar card or show my PAN card in which there will be my name, which will be issued by a trusted party, which is the government of India. And hence I'm establishing that I am Chandresh by means of providing some proof to it. Okay, so that is my authentication part. What is authorization? Say you are working for an organization and they use some card, some kind of a smart card or RFID card for access restriction on certain floors. It is a 7-floor building, and not everybody is allowed to have access to all 7 floors. Some people are working on 2nd floor, so they have access to only 2nd floor and the common area. Then some people are working on 2nd and 3rd floor, so they have access to both the floors in addition to the common area and stuff like that, so on and so forth. So what authorization defines is it is the scope of access to an authenticated user. So the user must, when the authorization process is effective, when you have already authenticated the user, when you have already established the user's identity, then only authorization makes sense. And authorization is basically simply, in simple words, is scope of access to the organization's assets or resources to that particular individual who has already established his identity used through an authentication method. Then comes accounting. What accounting is basically you keep a note of everything that this user who is already authenticated and has certain authorization, you keep a note of whatever interactions he or she is making with their company assets, so that in case of a doubt or in case of a mishap happening, you'll be able to trace the steps back. You have an audit log of everything that has been done by this individual on your assets, and you can simply track it back to certain individual or certain parameter changes which were implemented in the information systems of the organizations or the assets of the organization. So identity is me claiming to be somebody. Authentication is me. Authentication is the organization establishing the fact that somebody who is willing to be identified as somebody is that somebody. So establishing that somebody who is claiming to be somebody is that somebody. And authorization is basically scope of access to the organization resources for an authenticated user. And auditing or accounting is simply a log of all the changes or anything, all the interactions which were performed by that authenticated user on your information assets. or company resources. So I hope that that is clear so far. Wow, this is great. So these are the basic fundamentals of IAM, which is Identity Access Management. Okay, I hope that is clear so far. Now we'll take up each and every of these individually, except for the I, because I is very simple. You are claiming to be somebody. That's it. That is what identification is. That is what your identity is. And generally, all the organizations do have a store of identities. For example, you must have heard about Active Directory, MSAD, Microsoft Active Directory, which is an identity store. Sorry guys, just give me a second. There's a technical glitch. My pen is not working as expected. Just give me a second here. Okay. Just a second, guys. Sorry for this interruption. Okay. Yeah. So identity is every organization has a store of identity, generally, which is an MSAD, which is Microsoft Active Directory, which is a hierarchical database in which you make some organizational units within which you store some identities, either users or computers or groups, etc. So on and so forth, security groups and multiple types of groups that you store. So this is a basic identity store. And then there are authentication and authorization services also running on it. Say Kerberos is there for authentication and whatnot. Moving on to authentication assurance levels. So when we talk about authentication systems, every system, how secure it is, every authentication system, how secure it is defined by the assurance level that it offers. It ranges from 1 to 3. 1 is least secure, 3 is most secure. So whenever there is a question of authentication assurance level, just remember that it measures the level of security that your authentication system offers. Now coming to MFA, what MFA is, it is multi-factor authentication system. So how do we authenticate ourselves? We can either authenticate ourselves, where authentication basically is proving your identity, is we can authenticate ourselves by using something we already know, or something we already have, or something we already are. Okay. So something you know, typically a password or say passphrase. Something you have, typically a token, a soft token or a hard token. You must be familiar with that also. And something you are is your biometrics. Everybody, I think, in the smartphone era must be familiar with this also. So something you know, you set the password. So it is assumed that you and only you know the password that you had set. And hence, that is one factor of authentication, that something you and only you know. And hence, it can be used to prove your identity. Then something you have, it can be a physical or soft token, which is generally TOP or TOTP or HOTP based authentication token, which can be used in addition to the password. So why it is called MFA? Because we use multiple factors. Say you're using this plus this, or you're using this plus this plus this, all three at the same time for somebody to get to authenticate somebody. Okay, so we can use these in combination, and that is why it is called a multi-factor authentication system, because you're using more than one factor to establish the identity to authenticate somebody in your system. Okay, something you have is a token which you physically possess, and generally it is a token can be sync or async. What is a synchronized token is? The server and your token are somehow in sync. Either there'll be a counter, generally there is a counter, and these can be of two types. It can be HOTP or TOTP. So how these are synchronized is called a moving factor. So in case of HOTP, the moving factor is an event. So every time, in case of HOTP, every time you generate a OTP or use an OTP, that is when it moves from one OTP to another. So once you use this OTP, only after that it will move to the next one. In case of time OTP, time-based OTPs, it will keep on changing after every 30, 60, or whatever amount of time it is there. So the moving factor in this case is your time. So after every 30 seconds plus 30 seconds, you'll get a new OTP, and you'll have to use this new OTP instead of using this. So your OTP expires in 30 seconds. You must have received SMSs. In case of OTPs, you must have received SMSs claiming that this OTP is valid for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 15 minutes. So that is what your moving factor is. Moving factor there is time. So as soon as that time limit is expired, that OTP is null and void. You'll have to generate an OTP again. So that was a synchronous OTP, because your server and your token are synchronized by some manner, which is a moving factor, which is called a moving factor. Now coming to async OTPs, async OTPs generally are driven by you provide some challenge to the system, and in return, it will run some logic and give you an OTP. So here is your challenge, and here is your OTP. So that is how async systems operate. It doesn't require the server and the token to be in sync. Okay. So that is the basic difference between the sync and async tokens. And sync tokens can be HOTP or TOTP. HOTP is an older technology. TOTP is a newer technology. So, and the key differentiating factor is your moving factor. That is what you need to remember, and if anything about the tokens. Then coming to something you are, the third factor of authentication is something you are, which is biometrics. So all must be familiar with Face ID, which is used by Apple, predominantly used by Apple. Then there are iris scanners, which are generally used by Samsung. In Samsung phones, it was very common in some past generations. Then there is your fingerprints, which is touch ID, or say any kind of a fingerprint sensor that is very common nowadays in your laptops and whatnot. So the biometric authentication systems, this third type of authentication systems, there's one key factor which shall be taken care of while choosing the biometric authentication system, which is called a type 1 error or a type 2 error. Type 1 error is a false negative, and type 2 is a false positive. Say you are using Face ID for authentication. Now, even if you present your own face that you had enrolled during the enrollment in Face ID, and still Face ID denies you access to your iOS device, then it is a type 1 error. It is a false negative, that it denied to grant you access despite it being you. So the person who was trying to authenticate him or herself was the right person, who was a legit person, but still he was denied access to the resources, and hence it is a false negative. Similarly, if say somebody tries to authenticate using your Face ID, tries to authenticate to your iOS device in the Face ID using your passport size photo or some other picture of you he may be having access to, and the Face ID system allows the user to have access to your iOS device, then it's a false positive, because it was not you who was trying to authenticate, but still the system allowed access to the device, and hence it was a false positive. So that is the type 1 and type 2 error. And since these are since in biometric authentication systems, you always have to figure out a sweet spot between these type 1 and type 2 errors, which is called a crossover error rate, where there is not too many type 1 errors and not too many of type 2 errors also. That is the kind of parameters that you set. So say you're using a biometric authentication system or any kind of a biometric authentication system, say fingerprint or Face ID, you'll see that, okay, if it is a 80% match, if I'm setting 80% match as a pass, and that is leading to a 50% type 1 errors and 50% type 2 errors, then I think it will be a sweet spot for me, because it is a 50-50 chance for me to get successfully authenticated, get the right user successfully authenticated. But we always shall try to minimize this kind of a case, because false positive is more dangerous, because you're allowing somebody who is not the legit person, who is not the authorized person, to have access to your resources. So you try to minimize the type 2 errors in any case. So why are we considering type 1 and type 2 errors? Because in biometric authentication systems, these are fuzzy systems, and hence you need to fine tune the parameters to allow for a sweet spot, which is a crossover error rate. Say I'm saying that at 70% accuracy, you allow the user to get in, because see, matching a face with stored data. So when you're presenting your face or any biometric data to the computer or to the device for authentication, it is matching the presented data with something which is already enrolled or present in its documents, in its memory or storage as a legit user. Okay, so matching a face data is a difficult process for any computer or any device, and hence we have to rely on certain probabilistic figure. Say a 70% match is good enough, and then we figure out type 1 and type 2 errors. If these are in check, then we reach the crossover error rate, and hence we allow that 70% to be our final setting, final parameter for a match, for a positive match. So that is multi-factor authentication, something you know, something you have, and something you are. So we talked about MFA, we talked about sync and async, time and hash based. We talked about biometric authentication, we talked about type 1 and type 2 errors, we talked about crossover rate. Now access control. So what I told you about authorization is, once you're authenticated, means that you have established that you're the person you're claiming to be. Now the scope of access is what authorization is. So this can be done by multitude of manners, say DAC and MAC. What is scope of access? This is a 7th-floor building. I'm coming back to the physical access control, 5, 4, whatnot. And first, I'm an employee who is working in 5th floor. I have a card. The company has issued me a card. And in here, the company has allowed this card to have access to just 5th floor. The gates of 5th floor will only open with this card, and not the gates of any other floor. So that is what my scope of access is. Since I need to use the 5th floor only, my card is having access to 5th floor only. So that is my scope of access. That is also a concept of least privilege. Least privilege says that only that much access shall be granted to a user in order for them to perform their duty to the fullest. Similarly, there are other concepts also that like need to know and separation of duty. Separation of duty we talked, I think, during some previous sessions because we talked about collision and all. So separation of duty, what happens is you have maker and checker. You involve two separate people, because if this person commits some wrong, then this person will be able to validate whether it was done erroneously or whether there was some error in the data which or the activity which was performed by the maker. So that is separation of duty, which allows for a checking, allows for a check on whatever the maker is doing or whatever the changes are being made on the system. And need to know is basically you shall be informed of only the things that you need to know and nothing more, nothing more than that. So it is like least privilege only. Okay, coming to authorization, which is scope of access, and access control hence can be performed by in two methods with in two modes. Access control could have two methods. One is discretionary and other is mandatory. So I think we have already talked about mandatory access control during our discussions on BIBA model. And discretionary, so let's talk about discretionary and mandatory access control. What discretionary access control says that the principle, so in case of access control, there are three parties. There are generally three parties. This is my subject, this is my object, and this is my rule set. Or if you remember the Clark-Wilson model, there was, yeah, attributes, you can say, rule set or attributes, yeah, whatever. In Clark-Wilson model, we discussed about transformation process and then constrained data types and unconstrained data types, and then your object. So it is somewhat similar to that. Your subject will go through our access control, which is basically a security kernel, because here we are enforcing the reference monitor concept. So your subject will access the object using the rule set which is defined here, which is basically a security control kernel, which is enforcing what? A reference monitor concept. What was a reference monitor? You have defined some policies. Now you'll ensure that whatever objects are behind this policy set shall be accessed only through enforcement of this policy. For example, if I've asked everybody, if I've asked only the admin users to have the right access on this particular website backend, then there must be a security kernel which will enforce this policy that only administrator, my authentication platform will ensure that only administrator and nobody else will be able to have right access on this backend of website console. So that is what the concept of security, the concept of reference monitor is, and security kernel is the implementation of a reference monitor concept. So this is your subject. This is the object on which the subject wants to do some, wants to interact with, and then there'll be a security kernel in between to modulate the operations to authenticate, authorize, and accordingly restrict the extent to which somebody can interact with the object. So in case of discretionary access control, what happens is there'll be a principal who is the owner of any object. Again, there is subject, there is object, and there is security kernel SK. The principal of this object will define which subjects are allowed to have what kind of access of this object, and hence it is on the discretion of this principal to choose who may have access to the object and to what extent. The scope of access and the identities which may have the access to the object is defined by this principle, and hence it is discretionary because it is on the discretion of the principal to define it. So our Windows operating system uses just this. I can show you that with this example. Say I have this cloudflare.exe. I'll go here. I haven't discussed Kerberos yet, Manike, so we'll discuss that. So this is where your discretionary access control is. The authenticated user is having modify access, read access, write access, and read and execute access. The system is having full control. The administrator is having this, and any user is having read, execute, and read only access. So this is what is called an ACL, which is an access control list. So in case of a discretionary access control, you'll mostly always meet an ACL also, which is access control list, where you define the roles of all users, like what a user can perform on the object which is in question. Okay, so DAC and ACL are you'll always meet ACL when DAC comes in picture. Now coming to MAC, which is mandatory access control. Mandatory access control is more penalizing, and what it means is basically the system will enforce, instead of a principal enforcing the controls, the system will enforce controls, and scope of access will be defined by the system itself based on the security label of particular object. So again, this is object, this is my system security kernel, and this is my subject, this is my object, this is my security kernel. Now I have certain security labels: top secret, secret, public, or whatever. So there are 3 levels, and I have said that only people who are having top secret clearance will be allowed to have access to the thing which is labeled as top secret. Then people who are having secret clearance will allowed to have only people who are having top secret clearance will be allowed to have read and write access on top secret, read access on secret, and read access on public. Similarly, only people who are having secret access will have read and write access on secret and read only access on public. Similarly, people who are having public label categorization will have read and write access on public only. So this is the kind of access control which MAC is. So MAC defines MAC is like a MAC basically is a more penalizing, more strict, more rigid control system, and where the system itself enforces the rules based on the security classification of the asset or the data, or the security label of the data. So that is DAC and MAC. Here you cannot customize anything. The system will enforce everything. Now coming to example group policy, which enforces it. Okay, what we'll do is you note your questions down. You save your questions for the end of the session. Okay. We'll entertain all the questions by the end of the session. So hold your horses. I hope DAC and MAC has been clear so far. If you have any questions, note it down somewhere. We'll discuss it by the end of the session. Okay. One more thing which comes under access control is session management. Say you have allowed somebody to have access to certain website. Say you have so if you have ever logged onto a router or any sensitive any portal which contains sensitive information, there is always a timeout to your session. If you're not doing anything in say 5 or 10 minutes, you'll be logged out and you'll have to authenticate yourself again. You'll have to prove your identity once again. So this is the kind of thing which we enforce in session management. So why do we do session management? We do session management to continuously enforce the, continuously is the keyword, to continuously enforce the authorization and authentication rules. So what session management does is it constantly keeps on checking whether the user who is using the system is authorized and is fully authenticated to use the system to the extent which it is using it. So that is what session management, that is what the concept of session management is. Idle session timeout or maximum retries or maybe cool down periods are all examples of controls that we put under session management. Then coming to Kerberos. Kerberos is an authentication protocol. There are three key elements of Kerberos. One is your user, second is your service provider or service. And here is your KDC, which is the heart and soul of Kerberos. It uses symmetric encryption. Okay, so symmetric encryption is being used here. Whenever you use and every KDC, key distribution center, has two services running in it. One is your authentication service, and second is your ticket granting service. So this is your authentication service. Second is your ticket granting service. And now what happens is, say this is a user who requires to access a file or printer service. Say this is your printer. Okay. And this user wants to print a file. Now this user is, this printer is, the printer spooler service is my service provider. In this case, printer spooler in case of Windows. Okay. So what happens is user will go to this authentication service. Authentication service will grant the user, if successfully authenticated, will grant a user a ticket granting token. Okay. Once the user has the ticket granting token, it will take this ticket granting token to this ticket granting service. Now, what ticket granting service will do is, ticket granting service will issue a service token, which will move back to the user here. And now this user will take this ticket granting, now this user will take the service token along with its request to the printer spooler service to access the printer. So that is how Kerberos functions. It has basically the KDC as heart and soul, within which two services are running: authentication service, ticket granting service. User authenticates with authentication service, and which in turns issues a ticket granting token to it for that very context. For example, if I go to the authentication service and ask that I want to use printer spooler service, then it will issue a ticket granting token for that particular security context or for that particular scope. It will issue the ticket granting token for this user, say Chandresh, to have access to printer spooler service from this time to this time. There'll be a time also embedded in it, some time component also embedded in it. So say a session of 15-20 minutes will be assigned, the information pertaining to the session length also will be embedded in the ticket granting token itself. Then I'll take the ticket granting token to the ticket granting service, and then this ticket granting service will issue me a service token, which the service ticket, token is used in SAML. So it will be a service ticket. And I'll take the service ticket to the service which I wanted to use, which is printer spooler in this case. And then I'll be able to print the document. So that is how Kerberos functions. If you have any doubts, any questions, we can discuss it by the end of the session. I'm not seeing chat box, so hold the questions, pin it, we'll discuss it. Now coming to federated identity services. What is federated identity services is? Basically, say your organization is merged. For example, Union Bank was recently, there was a merger of Union Bank. There was a merger of Corporation Bank and Andhra Bank to Union Bank. Okay. They all must be having their own Active Directories, which are the identity stores, and these are independent of each other. So say a user which is sitting here, this innocent user which is sitting here, wants to access the printer which is sitting here. Now, this AD in which a Kerberos is running, Kerberos service is running on port 88 typically, which is the default port of Kerberos. So this user goes to this AD, but this printer is part of this AD, Union Bank AD. Hence, it doesn't trust the token issued by this, and it may not be able to, and this eCorp AD may not be able to issue a token for this resource which is sitting over here. So how do we communicate in such case where there are multiple identity sources involved? That is where the federated identity service come in play. In case of AD, what we can do is there is one thing called trust relationships. You can have trust relationships, and trust relationships are directional in nature. So say Union Bank AD can trust eCorp AD, but this eCorp doesn't still trust Union Bank, or maybe eCorp trust EAB, but it doesn't trust on the other direction. So these are directional in nature. So generally, whenever we are dealing in such situations, we always establish a two-way trust. In this way, both the objects, so there can be user objects, there can be computer objects, there can be security groups, etc., etc., etc. All the objects can be able to have access to the resources on the other Active Directory in both the directions. So trust relationship is one way of achieving federated identity services. So what federated identity is basically is you have one identity which can be used across multiple service providers. So if you go back to the basic diagram, user, service provider, and here's your security kernel. This security kernel case will be your federated identity provider. Okay. And these services will be located in multiple, these services will be member of multiple identity pools. So these are using different, these are trusting different identities. And then you form this federated identity mechanism, which is trusted by all the identity pools, and hence the user can have access to any of the services which is related to any of the identity pools, which is trusting any of the identity pools. So there are multiple protocols. We'll briefly talk about SAML, OpenID, and OAuth. So what SAML is? SAML is basically security assertion and markup language. It is a method to authenticate. So note that it doesn't authorize. Authorization will be taken care by some other protocols. What SAML does is SAML simply tells, and in XML message format, that this user is authenticated, and hence the next protocol which will be responsible for authorization will take care of the authorization part. In SAML, there'll be a principal, again the user, there'll be a service provider, again a service, and there'll be a identity provider where the IDs are stored, as we have already discussed. And assertion tell the, as we have already talked about, the scope of access. So these security assertion markup language, this A assertion tells about the scope of access, the time till which it will be valid, the user who is authenticated and whatnot. So it is basically it is a protocol which is used for authentication and not for authorization. Then coming to OpenID, what OpenID is basically a authentication protocol. And I hope you must have already used it somewhere or the other on the internet. So you must have come across websites which offer you to log in with, say, your Google profile or your LinkedIn profile or your other social profiles and whatnot. So these are all on the back end using OpenID itself. OpenID allows for that. So OpenID is basically an authentication protocol. And with this, you can sign in on multiple locations using one identity only. Then comes the OAuth. OAuth is used for, this is for authentication. This is also for authentication. This is for authorization. Although you can authenticate with OAuth, but that is called a pseudo authentication. That is not a full authentication. For you to properly authenticate and authorize using the OAuth, we generally use OpenID Connect, which is a service which runs on top of with these both of these protocols run on top of HTTPS, which is a L7 protocol. So this all thing is happening on layer 7 of OSI. So what OpenID Connect does is there's an OAuth layer, there is an OpenID Connect layer, and then which is running on HTTP stack. Okay, so that is how it looks when you implement it. OpenID is used for authentication, OAuth is used for authorization, and basically it again, just like Kerberos or just like SAML, it gives a token which contains the scope of access for the subject which has tried to access the object. Cool. Now we're coming to IDaaS, which is basically, we have already discussed about cloud delivery models, which is IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. Then there is infrastructure as a code and stuff like that. Similarly, one of the cloud delivered service is IDaaS, which is identity as a service, which basically, if you have worked on M365 or something like that, M365 is nothing but Microsoft's productivity suite, just like Google Workspaces. So either Workspaces or M365, if you have worked on this, you must have come across something which resembled an IDaaS. And IDaaS can be cloud native. So your identity store is located on cloud itself and not on-prem. It can be synced. Synced meaning the same identities which are on your on-prem are synced with the cloud instance also. So these are always in sync. This can be linked. So whenever you come on cloud for authentication, it will send a request to the on-prem device, on-prem identity store. And this on-prem resources will in turn send a token of authentication or authorization or both to the cloud instance, cloud resource, and then the user will get authenticated. So one good example of this is when you implement M365 in your environment with AD being your on-prem identity store. So this is cloud, this is on-prem. You have your AD here, and you have your M365 resources located on the cloud. What you do is you set up a AAD Connect, Azure AD Connect basically. And here you can choose this AD is linked here, and then it is giving authentication tokens here in M365. Now you can choose between PTA, PHS, and these are authentication mechanisms in M365. What is PTA? It is pass-through authentication. What it means is user a request lands on an authentication request lands on M365 portal. Say I'm accessing outlook.office.com from my browser, from my device. Request will land here. It will be sent, pass through. It will be sent to the on-prem AD. There, whatever identity that I've provided here will be matched with my record, which is available in the AD. If there is a record and the user is authenticated successfully, it will send a success token here. And then M365 itself will be having authorization records, whether a user is allowed to access its mailbox, SharePoint, or whatever resources which are there, OneDrive folders and whatnot. So the user will then be allowed to have access to those resources, which it is authorized to have access to. So that is pass-through authentication. Your credentials will move from here till here to on-prem, and on-prem will in turn send a token of authentication to the cloud instance. That is your pass-through authentication. Sorry, on-prem to rahega. Okay. Here's my AD connect. Now, what happens in PHS is, this is called a password hash sync. So your passwords here are stored in hash format. Okay. What it will do is there'll be a time period, say 15 minutes. Every 15 minutes, it will take a copy of all the hashes which are stored here on your on-prem. It will store it here. And whenever a user request lands here, it will match whether it is authenticated or not. If it is not authenticated, it may go to here for authentication, meaning PTA will be used as a fallback to PHS. PHS will be used as primary authentication method. If PHS fails, then PTA will be used. Basically, if say within those 15 minutes of sync window, you have created one new user, which is not replicated on your cloud instance, then it will fall back to PTA, pass-through authentication, and authentication request will go to your on-prem location, on-prem AD, and authentication will succeed. So PTA, this pass-through authentication is an example of this linked and federated IDaaS, because each and every identity which is here, of which authentication rules are set here, is linked to the identities which are stored on-prem. And every time an authentication request comes, it will land to your on-prem AD itself. What password hash sync is, basically a synced IDaaS. Hope I was clear. Hope I made you understand. So this is mostly it in the identity and access management. With this, I wish to conclude this session. We'll move to the questions pertaining to this domain. And if you have any questions, there are some 5 questions, I guess, pertaining to these domain. After discussing the 5 questions, in the same manner as we did the questions of previous domain in the beginning of this session, we'll take your questions. Okay. So moving on to the first question pertaining to this domain. Which of the following is not a weakness of Kerberos? You have 20 seconds because you'll have to read it and drop your options in chat. Your 20 seconds are up. And okay, seems like everybody has gotten it right. Since it is Kerberos uses symmetric encryption, as I've already told you, hence information is not encrypted is not a weakness of Kerberos. Okay, and KDC is a single point of failure, heart and soul of Kerberos. So yeah, it is there. Compromise of KDC, yeah, it is there. Susceptible of password guessing, yes, it is there. Second question is, what type of access control the owner of a file to grant other user access to it using an access control list? So what is this type of access control? You have 10 seconds. Drop your options, put your answers in chat. And I hope I had made myself very clear while explaining you DAC, that DAC uses ACL, and still somebody has gotten it wrong. Okay, cool. Your 10 seconds are up. So as I've already told you that whenever DAC comes in picture, there will always be a talk of ACL, because DAC says that principle of the object is, it is on the discretion of the principal of the object to define the scope of access of the subject which is trying to access the object. Okay. So whenever there is a question of ACL or DAC, the second party will always pop up. So here we talked about access control, which grants other user to access to using ACL, access control list. So it will be discretionary access control. Cool. Moving on to mandatory access control is based on what type of model? Your time starts now. You have 10 seconds. And the 10 seconds are up. Cool. So let's go back to the MAC. In MAC, what we did is, cool. There is a divide in the options. There's a divide in the chat box. So we'll discuss this question. Stop putting your answers now. So let's go back to the MAC. In MAC, there were clearly defined tiers. There was security labels, and then your authorization was clearly defined like that. So this is an example of lattice-based model because there are multiple layers to it. Okay, it is clearly well defined in tiers, and hence it is a lattice-based model. What lattice basically means is, just like in onion, you keep peeling layers after layer and after layer. That is a lattice-based model. So it is a lattice-based model. Okay, moving on to the next question. BIBA is what type of access control model? Your time starts now. Okay, your time is up. And again, there is a divide and confusion in the chat box. So BIBA focuses on integrity and is a lattice-based model. And what else in these options is a lattice-based model? This is also lattice-based. Okay. So MAC is the correct option, correct choice. Okay. Let's move on. A security operations center has lost 3 firewall engineers and does not have the budget to hire replacements. Management has given a service desk technician an additional responsibility of only viewing firewall configurations for customer tickets. She is to make sure that right firewall policies, VPN usernames, and network address translation rules, NAT rules exist on the firewall, as well as verifying if site-to-site IPsec tunnels are active. The security administrator has created an account for this service desk technician, which is Casey, that enables her to view the firewall configuration and deploy any necessary changes as long as it is approved by the senior engineer. Which form of access management has not been followed? Your time starts now. And seems like everybody has read How to Think Like a Manager. Cool. Your time's up. Cool. Everybody has gotten it right. It is least privilege because, can anybody explain? Yeah, because it was just a service desk technician and he was supposed to have view access, but he was instead allowed to have write access. Deploy necessary changes. So he was supposed to view only, but instead he was given a new user ID with which she can deploy the rules also. So that is where it breached least privilege.